So hello everyone, thanks for coming today. Yeah, so before we get started, so let me just do a very quick reminder that today's talk will be recorded. So for people who are attending online, so if you don't want it to be seen in the recording, you can switch off your camera. So Professor Xiaolan is going to introduce our two professors for today's talk. So now we hand over to Professor Xiaolan.
Thank you, Danielle, for organizing this vacation in my room. Okay, for people who don't really know me, my name is Xiaolan Christensen, and I'm a professor of applied linguistics at the Department of Education in Bath. I'm going to introduce Professor Tony Lidikotter and Professor Yali Wang. We have two speakers today for the seminar. Thank you for all joining us here today. So Professor Tony Lidikotter is professor in the Department of Applied Linguistics at the University of Warwick and adjunct professor in Justice and Society at the University of South Australia. He is also a fellow of the UK Academy of Social Sciences and the executive editor of Current Issues in Language Planning and co-editor of the book series Language and Intercultural Communication in Education by Multilingual Methods. Professor Lidikotter's research spans a number of areas of applied linguistics, including language education, language policy and planning, and discourse analysis. Much of his work has focused on the relationship between the language and teaching and learning language and intercultural understanding, and how learning a foreign language can promote intercultural capabilities. Throughout his research, he has looked at classroom practices to understand the interrelationships between language and culture in the process of meaning making and how that can enhance language education. His work on language in education policy has greatly influenced the field of language education. He has also made his mark on how societies and institutions plan language education and what the consequences of such planning for teachers and students and society at large. Before Professor Lidikotter joined Warwick University, he worked in Australia at several universities, and he taught applied linguistics and linguistics. So his publication list is very, very long, and I wouldn't be able to read out all the list for you. It would take me quite a few hours to do that. So, but you can find all his publications online, and he's currently working on several projects, and so we're all about intercultural capability and testing assessment of this topic. So we are very much looking forward to reading the new publications. Okay, so
thank you, Xiaolan, and thank you for the invitation to be here at Bath. It's really nice to have this opportunity to be with you and to talk about this particular topic. So what I'm going to be talking about today is something that I've been working on relatively recently in my work in language policy. And in particular, this presentation comes from a chapter that I was invited to write by Charlene herself. So I've got double thanks for her today for inspiring this topic. When she asked me to contribute a chapter on language in education policy in the Asia Pacific region. And I've been working on language policy in Asia and started to look at this as an area, but I hadn't really looked at the Pacific until Charlene made me. So a lot of this is something that has come about because of circumstances in a way. But what this presentation is about is really looking at language policy at the supranational level, at the level beyond the nation. And that's a little bit different from the way we often do language policy research, which is very nation focused. And the advantages of looking at this as something supranational, supranational is that it allows us to look at a more geopolitical way of understanding language policy and planning by looking at regional similarities and differences. If we just look at individual nations, we miss some of the things that are going on at this higher level. And this means we've got an opportunity to start to understand some of these geopolitical processes that are at play in particular regions that shape what's going on. So we're moving here from macro level policy, looking at what governments do, to a supra-macro level, looking at something beyond the level of the nation state. And looking at the Asia Pacific area as a geopolitical context. So starting to look at something a little bit beyond sort of bodies that do language planning and look at how things might happen across areas. Now, language policy studies have been really polity-based, looking at the practices in bounded contexts, whether that's macro policy, where we look at one nation, or micro levels, where we might be looking at one family or one institution or something like that. It tends to be something quite contained. But the reality is that policies are always influenced by something beyond the level of the particular bounded group, and that both local and non-local phenomena are important. And those non-local phenomena include various sorts of geopolitical processes, such as colonization, or it might be that there are particular dominant ideologies and discourses that are operating outside those bounded contexts. So, for example, neoliberalism as a way of understanding education. And there's also the phenomenon of policy borrowing, that policies developed in one state end up being used in many other states. A really good example of that will be the Common European Framework of Reference, which was designed for one particular purpose in Europe and is now being used for very different purposes in very different places. So policy is not something that just sort of exists in its own little context. So we can actually see in the sorts of studies that are typically done how some of these non-local things, like the ideologies and so on, influence a particular context, but we can't see beyond that. We can't see how it's shaping things at a larger level. Whereas if we start to look at things in regional terms, we can start to look at the ways that different processes and practices impact on those particular local contexts, and look at some of the shared elements, the commonalities that exist between policies in different places, and also the points of difference, that is, the divergences between how things play out in different contexts. And I think the Asia-Pacific region is really interesting for seeing some of those commonalities and divergences. So what is the Asia-Pacific region? If you go online and look at how people define the Asia-Pacific, you'll find that there are dozens and dozens of different ways of defining it. And I wanted to sort of look at a way that would work to understand some of these commonalities and divergences. And the way I decided to operationalize the Asia Pacific was firstly to take what is called ASEAN +3, that is the ASEAN nations plus 3 East Asian nations. I'd actually looked at this with Andy Kirkpatrick in some other work, looking at what was happening across that sort of area. Now, that's not all of Asia, but it is the more Pacific bit of Asia, if you like. So ASEAN then looks at Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, and Vietnam. And then there are 3 Asian nations, East Asian nations, China, Japan, and South Korea. So that's how I'm going to define Asia for the purposes of this paper. There's nothing particularly magical or mystical about this. Asia can be defined in very many different ways, but I think this is a useful way for a comparison with the Pacific. Then for the Pacific, I decided to look at a group called the Pacific Islands Forum, which is the majority of independent states within the Pacific area. So these are Cook Islands, Fiji, Kiribati, Republic of Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Nauru, Niue, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Now, I excluded 2 particular countries that are in the Pacific Islands Forum because I don't think they pattern very well with the rest. And those are Australia and New Zealand. Now, Australia and New Zealand are quite different in the sense that they're settler colonies where European colonizers actually form the dominant population these days. And that's very different from all of the other regions. So I thought that was so different geopolitically that they didn't really fit with this group. So I excluded those. Now, I've also excluded lots of other places in the Pacific, simply because they're not part of these, but I don't think that's a problem. I've excluded most of the French-speaking areas of the Pacific, but those particular areas are actually governed directly from France and really represent European language policy in the Pacific rather than something uniquely Pacific. I've also excluded the Eastern Pacific Rim, which is often included in the Asia Pacific, that is North America and South America. But I'm also excluding those for similar reasons to those I'm using for Australia and New Zealand, that the experiences in those countries are actually historically quite different from the sorts of places that I've included by drawing on the Pacific Islands Forum. This was just a way of trying to operationalize what the Asia Pacific meant and also trying to control it a little bit for the purposes of a study. You can see I'm looking at a very large number of societies already in this without adding all of those other possible things of all Asia and all of the Pacific that I could have been looking at. Now, the Asia-Pacific region is ethno-linguistically highly diverse, but the diversity is different in different places. So we have differences in degree. Some nations are really highly ethno-linguistically diverse. So if you think of nations like China or the Philippines or New Guinea, where there are hundreds of minority groups, but others are much more homogenous. So if we look at a country like Japan, which has some minority groups and also immigrant groups, but diversity is not particularly marked. Or very small countries like Niue and Nauru, where there is not a great deal of diversity. There is still diversity in those places, but much less diversity. The diversity that we find in the Asia Pacific also comes about historically for different reasons. It can come about because of the presence of numerous languages within an existing territory. So if you think about places like Myanmar or Malaysia or Indonesia, the diversity is there territorially. It's there before the creation of the political boundaries. But there are also cases where population flows have influenced the diversity through various forms of immigration. So if we look at a country like Fiji, for example, there are varieties of Fijian spoken there, but also there is a very large presence of Fiji Hindi that resulted from indentured labor during the colonial period. So a very large population, I wouldn't even say they were a minority population these days, comes about as a direct result of population movements through colonialism. We can also see things related to the Chinese diaspora through Southeast Asia and East Asia, so Chinese communities in Vietnam or Indonesia or Philippines and so on. So there are multiple forms of linguistic diversity going on here. There's also the impact of colonialism, particularly English and French colonialism in the region. Obviously, Netherlands colonialism in Indonesia as well, but most of the colonies that we're looking at are going to be either well, there will be former English colonies, some presence of French. As I said, the French are still there in their colonial possessions in the Pacific. They haven't been colonized at this stage. Now, most of the nations of the Asia-Pacific region were colonized, although at different times with different time depths, and only gained their independence in the 20th century. Now, there are exceptions. There were countries that were never colonized or never fully colonized, like China and Taiwan. China was partially colonized with the areas of influence along the coast, but not colonized in the same sense as other places. Thailand was managed to maintain its independence throughout the colonial period, but most places were colonized. The colonization in Asia was much earlier in many cases than in the Pacific, with some colonies starting about the 16th century in parts of Asia, but really only fully developing the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the Pacific. So there are different histories of colonization in different parts of the region we're talking about. There's also continued colonialism. Some of the states that are independent states in my list of Pacific Island nations are actually what is called free association with other societies. So Niue and the Cook Islands are in free association with New Zealand, which means there is still a colonial influence of New Zealand on those particular societies. Micronesia, Palau, Marshall Islands are also in free association with the United States. And as I said, the French-speaking territories in the Pacific have never been decolonized. So there is ongoing impact of colonialism. The colonialism was mainly done by European powers, and there's quite a list of them. You can see United Kingdom, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Russia as historical colonizers in the area, but also the United States in parts of the Pacific, especially in the Philippines, but also Micronesia. And Australia, New Zealand, Japan as a colonizer in Korea and Taiwan. So there is a different sort of nature of colonialism, and Indonesia controlled East Timor until the 1990s, after it was decolonized by Portugal in 1975. So some of the colonizers were in fact Asian countries, but mostly European countries. And of those, United Kingdom and France were the dominant colonizers. Germany lost its colonies during the First World War, and they ended up being mandate territories for Australia and New Zealand. So a very strong English language presence among the colonial powers in many of the countries we're talking about. So just to give you an idea of what we're talking about in terms of language and education policy and planning, which is the focus that I'm looking at. I'll go a little bit outside that directly, but most of my emphasis is going to be on this. Language and education policy and planning covers a large number of things, and those things on the handout, not the handout, the PowerPoint that are in red are the things I'm going to be focusing specifically on as the topics of main interest. So the first is acquisition of literacy in an official language as a first language. So that would be the teaching learning of Chinese in China or Indonesian in Indonesia as examples. But it can also be an acquisition of official languages as a second language. The teaching of the national language to minority students would be an example of that. I'm not specifically going to talk about that because there's very little of that as a real policy in any of these countries. Mostly minorities are treated the same way that first language speakers are treated at policy level They may not be in practice, but at policy level. There's a lot of focus on the acquisition of literacy. You'll see it's not quite that simple, and I will be alluding to some of these issues as we're talking, but it's not my main focus because it's not a main policy focus. Educational support for maintenance of minority languages. I will talk about minority languages and how they're included, even though there's not a lot of policy for those. And I think that's one of the main features that I want to emphasize. The acquisition of minority languages as second languages, there's almost nothing of that, so it's not worth talking about. Acquisition of foreign languages, English being the most obvious one of those. So I'll be talking about that. And then the teaching an official language in other countries, the sort of things, for example, China might do through Confucius Institutes and so on. That's not really particularly relevant in the context that I'm talking about. So I'm going to focus really on official languages, maintenance of minority languages, and the teaching of foreign languages in the presentation today. So if we start to look at the policy processes in the Asian Pacific region that are important for understanding what's going on, there are a number of things that are important to look at. So there is the idea of nation building and the role of language in nation building. As I said, most of the countries in the region became independent. They became nations for the first time in their current configurations during the 20th century. So the idea of creating the nation was really important, and language played a role in that. Associated with that is the general medium of education policy. That is, what is the normal language of schooling in these societies? And there are things that I want to look at about exogenous languages, languages from outside the region. I want to look at the place of English in particular, because it has a very particular place in our policy these days. But I also want to look at the place of languages other than English and see how that plays out, but not so much emphasis on that last part. So let's start by looking at nation building. So as I said, we have these newly independent societies, and what had been happening prior to independence across the whole region is that the colonial governments usually used the colonizers' language in education. That wasn't always the case, especially in some of the English colonies. There was sometimes a division into elite education in the colonial language and non-elite education in local languages. Pennicook writes really nicely about the place of Cantonese education in Hong Kong, for example, where English was used to develop the people who were going to rule the colony on behalf of the English, and Cantonese education was used to create docile followers by emphasizing the Confucian idea of obedience to the ruler. Not other Confucian ideas, just the ones that were really important to the colonizers. So that idea of obedience was developed through Cantonese language education. So there was some local language education in some places, but the really strong emphasis was on the language of the colonizers in order to co-opt locals into the colonial regime. So at independence, as I said, nation building was a key aim for many of these newly independent nations, because they hadn't existed as nations. They'd existed as multiple geopolitical entities. So Indonesia, for example, was hundreds of kingdoms. It wasn't one country. And this was an issue for very many of the societies that were emerging, to create a country where there hadn't been a history of nation states before. But it was also taken on in areas that had not been directly colonized. So the idea of nation building was quite important in the major restoration in Japan after 1868, creating a Japanese national identity that included the Ainu and people from Ryukyu Islands and so on. But also in China, particularly after the 1949 revolution, creating the particular state. And that happened earlier, but was really intensified in the post-1949 period. So this nation building project involved a number of things. It involved technological modernization, economic modernization, integrating into the economic systems of the world, the global economic systems, in ways that hadn't been really realized during colonialism. They've been integrated into the colonial system rather than into a wider global economic system. But also there was the issue of developing some form of national identity in these complex multilingual states. And that became a really big issue for many of the states, especially those in Asia. So language policy was closely associated with both of those objectives, modernization and national identity, but with different emphases in different places. So this is the one I need to show you. Here's a list of the official languages of each of the polities we've got in this study. And I've emphasized there the polities in Asia. And if you look at the polities in Asia, what you will see is that in these societies, by and large, a national language was chosen from among the local languages spoken in those societies. They're mainly monolingual policies, but monolingual in a local language. There are exceptions, of course, with the Philippines and with Singapore, but you can see overwhelmingly we have a monolingual national language policy and a policy that favors local languages. If we compare that to the Pacific, sorry, the ones in white, you'll see there's something quite different going on. In each of those societies, the former colonial language, that is English, has been maintained, usually alongside a local language, but not always. So if you look at the Federated States of Micronesia, for example, you'll see that it is a monolingual English-speaking country. Vanuatu is slightly different. It's got two former colonial languages because Vanuatu was created out of a rather unusual colony called a condominium, which was jointly ruled by England, well, the United Kingdom and France. And part of Vanuatu was a French colony and part of Vanuatu was an English colony. They got joined together and they're now a trilingual colony with a local language, Bislama, which is an English-based pidgin rather than a purely local language. I mean, it is purely local, it's spoken only in Vanuatu, but it's not local in the same way. Papua New Guinea is also an exception. It has 4 official languages these days: English, Tok Pisin, Hirimoto, and PNG Sign Language. Again, Tok Pisin is an English-based Creole. Hirimoto is a Motu-based Creole, Motu being a language of Papua, no, of New Guinea, the northern bit of Papua New Guinea, the former German colony. Sign language was added only very recently to that particular list. So you can already see there's something different happening between Asia and the Pacific here. There's something different about the reaction to colonialism, the decolonizing process. In Asia, the main focus was to remove the language of the colonizer. In the Pacific, the main focus was to retain the language of the colonizer. What's going on here is actually quite interesting because the sorts of arguments that were being made in the Pacific were actually quite different from the sorts of arguments that were being made in Asia. Asian independence was very strongly motivated by the development over a long period of time of nationalist groups that sought to consolidate a particular nationalist identity. That was less developed in the Pacific. But also there are other features. A lot of the languages used that became official languages in Asia were languages that had previously been used for quite complex functions of state development they had literate traditions and so on, whereas the languages of the Pacific hadn't been used in the same way. So all of the languages that have become official, that are Pacific languages, were originally non-literate languages. They had no writing systems, they weren't used for literate purposes. And one of the things that seems to have been a feature at the time of colonization was a sense that these languages weren't adequate for the work of government, that you had to use a colonial language because it had that literate history and your language didn't even have a writing system. So there was obviously a language hierarchy going on at that particular time. So then, what was happening in Asia was that language was included as a way of indexing national identity. That is, everyone would learn the national language in order to have the national identity. And so they rejected the use of the colonial language and chose a local language to mark that new national identity post-independence and post-colonial, but very much based on a one language, one nation ideology, which itself is a product of European colonialism. It's something that emerged during the French Revolution and the Romantic period in Europe that was exported all over the world. But there was also an argument being used in Asia that you needed to expand the human capital of your nation by expanding literacy, and that literacy would be developed in the official language. So you have a rejection of colonialism and a desire for high levels of literacy. And so the emphasis in language policy was what we call internal language spread. That is, teaching the official language of the nation to groups in the nation that didn't speak it. And so a lot of emphasis goes into this idea of spread. And you can see that in all of the multilingual nations of the Pacific. There was this idea of pushing your language into new communities as a way of bringing the society together around this idea that a nation had to have one language and that this language was a symbolic marker of identity, and the idea that you needed to expand literacy. So these two things were happening hand in hand. Identity and literacy development go together. In the Pacific, this idea of national identity seems to be much less important in the thinking around policy, and maintaining the national language, the colonial language was less linked to this idea of identity. And as I said earlier, the colonial language was chosen because it was believed to be suitable for the purpose of government. It had been used for government, it had been used for education. It had that sort of prestige of a long literate tradition. But also it was seen as a language that would provide connection to the wider world. So if you happen to be a tiny little Pacific nation like Kiribati or Niue or Nauru, you didn't see your language as giving you connection to anywhere else. So you wanted a language that would give you connection. That was less an issue, I think, in the decisions around official language policy in the Asian region, where the languages were actually much bigger to start with. But it was a real issue for people in the Pacific. And if you read the policy documents, they often talk about the importance of English, because it's almost always English, for connecting to the wider world. So local languages are for local purposes. English is if you want anything outside. So in a sense, there's a sense that local languages don't provide a lot of cultural capital for use at the national level. And the economic dimension of development seems to have been much more important as a deciding factor in the Pacific than the identity dimension of national development. Whereas national identity wasn't seen as in conflict with the economic modernization of the country in contexts of Asia. Although sometimes Singapore is a really good counterexample for that. Now, many national policies, as you noticed, were monolingual. And multilingualism itself represents a more complex way of understanding nation building. So what we can have in multilingual policies is an idea that the colonial language has an economic focus and the local language has an identity focus. So if you think about Singapore, for example, where English is the language of the whole society, but everyone has a mother tongue that is sort of assigned to you because of your ethnic identity, not necessarily because it's the language of your heritage, but because it's your official language of ethnic identity. So many Hindi speakers have Tamil as their mother tongue, even though it's from a totally different language family. But it's there as an identity focus. Okay, so it's for local purposes. We can see the same thing in Pacific nations, any of them. I've chosen Samoa to give an example of where Samoan is used as the language of Samoa to express Samoan identity, but English is used for just about everything else. And in fact, you see that in the curriculum. In Samoa, after a certain period in primary school, Samoan is reserved to two areas of the curriculum: Samoan language and Samoan culture. Everything else is taught in English. Okay, it's a very local identity marker. That's a common pattern across the Pacific region. It's a common pattern actually across all of the multilingual areas, that English tends to be used much more widely in instruction than the local language. Now, when multilingualism has been developed, it's been drawn on to address intergroup conflict. So, for example, if we look at the situation in Singapore, English, because it's not the language of any ethnic community, is seen as contributing to greater social harmony than selecting, say, Chinese as the most widely spoken language, which would alienate the Indian groups and Malays. So selecting one of those local languages would have privileged someone else and created some form of ethnic tension. Same is true in Fiji. Fiji has got English, Fijian, and Hindi. You need both Fijian and Hindi because of the massive ethnic conflict between Fijians and Indian Fijians that has had quite a violent history, actually, in the past, and has led to coups and all sorts of things. So it's a very fractured identity. And the inclusion of both languages is an attempt to try and overcome that fractured identity. And the same is true of Vanuatu. Vanuatu, English and French, because if you had English, the former French colonies would feel isolated. If you had French, the former English colonies would feel isolated from the national identity. So you need both of those languages there. The multilingualism may also be the result of some form of historical legacy. So the use of English in Hong Kong, for example, comes about because of the presence of English there in a particular way that wasn't in the rest of China. The same is true of Portuguese in Macau. In fact, Portuguese in Macau is really interesting because there's very strong support for maintaining Portuguese as an official language in Macau, but very little support for actually learning it and using it. It's there as a symbolic marker of a Macau identity, rather than because it's a widely spoken language. It's there for historical reasons rather than practical reasons. There for symbolic reasons more than anything. English is much more complex than that, of course. Okay, so when we start to look at medium of instruction, what we actually see happening is that only a very small number of languages end up being used in the education system. And I'll just go on to the next slide, where we can look at the particular languages that are used as medium of instruction. One of the things you can see is that where there is one official language, there is commonly one common medium of instruction. I'm not saying that in various schools, English medium instruction might not exist here. And say, what's the normal language that is used for teaching in these societies? Now, some of these are interesting. The ones that I've shaded in light pink here are languages, areas where the local language and English, usually the colonial language, are taught together. They're both used as medium of instruction, but what actually happens is the proportion of English to local language increases over time. So the local language gets phased out. Now that doesn't happen in all of the societies. Brunei, for example, uses Malay and English all the way through. Malay maintains its position. But in most of these cases, it's a transition from something that is much more local to something that is much more English. Papua New Guinea is actually a really interesting example because the policy until 2013 was to use local languages wherever possible. There were some 400 languages used in primary school in Papua New Guinea in 2013. The current policy says there should be a greater emphasis on English, but that emphasis on English hasn't really filtered through to what's happening on the ground so far. What's really interesting is local languages can include Kiriimoto and Tok Pisin, which are official languages, but doesn't have to. The language that has to be included is English. So it's really interesting. Some of the official languages are never taught to some of the students in those societies. The darker pink examples are cases where the local language, even if it's official, has a marginal place in education. So in Kiribati, for example, the Kiribati language is taught only as a subject. It's not a medium of instruction. The only time you use Kiribati is in that particular bit of the curriculum. Everything else is taught in English. Nauru is really quite interesting because Nauruan is not taught used as a medium of instruction at any point in the school system. Nauru is a very small island. The majority of the population speak Nauruan. There's not a lot of internal diversity in the forms of Nauruan that are spoken. People, when they go to school, speak Nauruan, but school speaks English. So, but Nauruan is still an official language. So it's really interesting. Singapore is also an example that's like that. The other mother tongues are taught as subject, but everything else happens in English. So we can see that in a number of these places, there may be multiple languages, but it's not equal distribution of multiple languages, where there are multiple languages taught. Fiji is an interesting example. It's interesting because although schools are either English and Fijian or English and Hindi in terms of their medium instruction, everyone has to learn the other official language. So if you're Fijian, you have to learn Hindi. If you're Hindi, you have to learn Fijian. So it's the only example here where all of the official languages are actually taught to all the students in these multilingual situations. Singapore is not the case. If you're Chinese, you're not going to learn Tamil or Malay. You might, but it's not a requirement. Oh, I forgot. Malaysia, really interesting. English is widely used as a medium of instruction, but is not an official language. So we have an example there, something very different. So if we move back, what's actually happening in these places is that the education of linguistic minorities in these places is actually conceptualized only in terms of developing language and literacy. That those societies like Philippines and Papua New Guinea, where local languages are used in education, it's transitional, etc. That the idea is you bring people into school using their local language, then you get rid of it in order to focus on something else, usually English. Not always, but usually English. It's uncommon for these local languages to be taught systematically unless they're an official language. But even if they are the official languages, they may not be taught systematically within the school. The emphasis on these may be reduced throughout time. And in most cases, minority languages have just a marginal role. So the place of English then, basically what we can see happening is what we call an English knowing bilingualism. Through the policy throughout Asia and the Pacific is that everyone will know English and an official language. Okay, so bilingualism is really common. And that can be achieved through meeting instruction policy or through other things. So in China, for example, it's done by English as a subject. Okay, so in Asia, it's often English as a subject, but not always. In the Pacific, it's always through meeting instruction policy. And societies that haven't chosen English as an official language privilege English in the education system. I think that's come across really clearly in everything I've said so far. And what has happened over time is English gets introduced earlier and earlier in the curriculum. 20 years ago, it was a high school subject. Now it's a primary school subject, just about everywhere. And you can see that. This is a list of where English is introduced. And if it doesn't say anything, it's introduced right at the very beginning. If it does say something, it's introduced afterwards. And you can see that the only place that introduces English officially in secondary school is Indonesia. Unofficially, it happens in primary school. It used to be in policy that would happen in primary school, but then it got changed. Japan has language activities for English, which are not really teaching English, but are sort of teaching English. It's a strange sort of policy. Foreign languages other than English are almost non-existent. It's changing a little bit at tertiary level in some places. China is interesting because the Belt and Road Initiative has led to increased learning of languages other than English in the tertiary curriculum. The only example I could find of a policy that specifies other languages by name was in Tonga, where they say students will also have opportunities to learn other languages, including French, Japanese, and Mandarin, or current opportunities to learn languages other than Tongan English, French, Mandarin, Japanese, or German will be maintained. Now, that's really interesting because I checked the website of every high school in Tonga, which doesn't take very long. I think there are 3, and none of them offer a foreign language other than English. So current opportunities being maintained means, no, you won't learn. So other languages are present, but they tend to be high prestige languages taught in the education system. Chinese is the most widely taught Asian language. The exception would be the University of South Pacific that offers a number of Pacific languages as part of its mandate. As I said, China's Belt and Road Initiative has led to some impact in China, but it's rather new, and what the impact really is, I think will take time to understand. So what's going on? Well, the policies are normally focused on 2 languages. There are very few places in which you would normally learn more than 2 languages, Fiji being one where that is the case. The one nation, one language ideology is very strong, but there are some exceptions. Literacy development has been developing some sort of monolingual uniform literacy in all of the states. And that has consequences for how local languages are positioned. They're usually sidelined in the curriculum. Minority languages are not seen as really having a legitimate place in the curriculum at all. And English is very significant as a medium of instruction or as an additional language. So what's going on? Well, Asian policies are more likely to select local languages for societies and educations than Pacific nations. They tend to be monolingual with an endogenous national language, a local language, although, as I said, there are exceptions. Pacific nations tend to have a colonial language, often with an endogenous language alongside, but usually has a second place. So the local language is of secondary importance to English. And why might these divergences happen? Well, the different size of the linguistic communities, Pacific languages are very small languages and therefore don't seem to have the prestige of larger languages. Different processes of colonization, smaller, less linguistically diverse nations emerged in the Pacific, larger, more diverse nations in Asia. This means that some things like identity weren't such a problem because the colonies were small, isolated communities before they were colonized. And so once they're independent, that isolation sort of led them to have an identity anyway. So language and national identity seem to be less significant for those more homogeneous communities in the Pacific. There's also this difference in literate cultures, that the languages of Asia tended to have had a literature and literary use before colonization, but not in the Pacific. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Ledico. This is such an interesting topic. Yeah, especially you gave us very good pictures of how Asian Pacific region's language in education policy looks like. That's very interesting. Yeah, because we start our talks a little bit late today, so we still have like 10 minutes question. So if anyone got any question, just feel free to ask the professor. Yeah.
Could you like project what's going to happen in the future?
No, it's always dangerous to guess what's going to happen in the future. Basically, I think not a lot of change. English will continue to dominate. Local languages where they're strong will continue to be strong. I don't see any threat to Chinese in China or anything like that. Pacific languages will tend to be marginalized within their own communities. I think the forces of neoliberalism are particularly strong for the support of English, and I don't think that sort of neoliberal view of economics is going anywhere quickly. So basically, I think what we're seeing is entrenched, possibly with a growth in significance for English in a number of places, like the 2013 change in Papua New Guinea was something that gave increased emphasis to English. And that seems to be happening. I think possibly moving earlier and earlier into the primary school curriculum with English is going to continue, where it has got to the beginning already, although the double reduction policy that we're going to hear about later in China seems to be a countermeasure to that. But I'm not sure how effective it is in actually changing behavior. Because every time I talk to people in China about the double reduction policy, they tell me that the children are actually doing more English outside school now rather than inside school. So it seems to have moved it into the informal part of schooling rather than the formal part of schooling, but hasn't actually changed anything. I don't want to preempt what the next speaker is going to say, but I just find this double reduction policy really interesting as a dynamic. So I'm looking forward to hearing some more about it.
Do you have a question from online?
Yes, there's an online question from Andy, and Andy says, are there any studies on how language of instructions transitions? So for example, like in a switch from the first language learner in primary schools to second language learners in secondary school.
Okay, yeah, there are lots of studies for lots of these places, less in the Pacific. The sort of small systems in the Pacific don't seem to generate a lot of research. What it actually seems to happen, however, is in reality, it's quite chaotic. The policy sort of says, well, at this point it'll be 70-30, and then it'll be 60-40, and then it'll be 50-50, et cetera, until it's 100% English. But in reality, there's a lot of translanguaging going on. I looked at some classroom data 30 years ago in Samoa, and so I actually discovered that Samoan was used almost as much in English medium of instruction as it was in Samoan medium instruction, and English was used as much in Samoan medium instruction as it was in English. They were using English to teach Samoan culture and things like that. It's really quite messy, and I think that's a common story of the transition. That it's not nearly as neat as the policy actually says, but it varies a bit from country to country. But you would expect that a place like Samoa, where the majority of children speak Samoan often as the only language when they get into school, would use more Samoan than English, but it often isn't the case. There's still a lot of translanguaging into English in that sort of environment.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Andy, for asking this question. And we got another question from the online audience. And Shani says, thank you for this interesting presentation. I would like to know what is the driving force for countries to introduce English at a younger age regarding the place of English?
Okay, well, basically it's the belief that an early start is better. Which is not necessarily something that the research is bearing out. People who start learning English later are not necessarily worse at English. That developing your first language before starting your second language has advantages. I say first language, I don't mean official language of the society, which is not always the same thing. But it's this belief that more time learning the language leads to a higher level of learning, which at one level sounds like common sense. The more time you spend learning something, the better it's going to be. But it seems that cognitive development before you start learning your second language offsets some of that. But there's this general belief everywhere that the earlier you start learning a language, the better. Parents certainly have a strong idea that that is the case. And parents are driving a lot of what's happening, I think, in policies. And again, with the double reduction policy, I think you see really nice evidence of parents doing stuff regardless of what the government says. And that's coming from the same belief that an early start is the best thing for language learning. And I think it's something that we as applied linguists should be cautioning people about. That it's not necessarily the best solution for young children, particularly in societies where English isn't already present. I mean, if they're using English every day outside school, then it's a different issue from a really foreign language context.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. And there's, yes, please. Yeah.
I'm not sure whether this question has relation to this, but I'm really curious about your attitude about the understanding of religion, because you mentioned national identity when we used to accept the different language. So I was wondering, do you think religion plays a very important role in this part, whether they could influence the attitude towards the different language?
Okay. It's a really hard question to answer because different religions have different associations with language. So, for example, Islam is not going to work particularly strongly for any of the languages involved here because Islam is so strongly tied to Arabic. And it does lead to some Arabic learning in Islamic societies, but doesn't seem to affect English or other things. I think the role of English is more evident during the colonial, the role of religion on language is more evident in the colonial period, that the particular missions, especially in the Pacific, were very strong in introducing English as the language of Christianity, but also in developing some of the local languages. So I think you need to look at religion in each society and look at what the religion is and what the religious configuration is. In Samoa, for example, religion was really complex in that there were different ways of writing Samoan for Protestants and Catholics. And what actually happened when Samoa became independent is they adopted the Protestant writing system, which was actually less accurate in terms of the phonological representation than the Catholic system, but there were more Protestants than Catholics. So religion can play all sorts of complex roles, but I think you need to look at that on a polity by polity basis, rather than trying to talk about it at the level of region.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Thank you. Yeah. So the next question is from the online audience. Prem is asking, so as far I understand, many of the Asian countries are trying to promote the mother tongue as languages of instruction. However, there is a continuity of English. So in this case, what do you think would be the position of English as it has already been a part of the society?
Okay, I might need to look at that question because there's a lot in it.
Yeah.
So just put it in the chat so I can see the question.
Hello, Tony, or
Yeah.
can I ask orally?
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Hi, Professor Tony. I'm Prem Prasad Podal from Nepal. We met in Bal in 2019, if you remember. Thank you so much for this inspiring presentation. So, as far as I understand, in Asian countries, the recent drive is towards more social justice dimension, where they try to promote the position of local languages as medium instruction, and there is a kind of multilingual drive. But at the same time, English has already been in use from pre-primary level. So how would you think? Can we just exclude English and think about the local language at up to certain grades? Or, like the confusing situation is, what would be the position of English in the early grades usually? Because it has already been a part of the society and it is moving here and there, and even in the family. So I think the total exclusion of English might create problems. So what do you suggest, or what do you think it should be the case, and how the multilingual drive can be better, gone into the society more effectively and more,
Okay, thank you very
more
much.
effectively. Yeah.
It's a really big and difficult question. One thing that's important is that this drive towards social justice doesn't exist in all of the societies we're talking about. One of the things that's quite interesting is that in many of these countries, minority language education, mother tongue education, exists only in the work of non-government organizations. It's the case in Malaysia, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, very many of these societies. And what actually happens is that people set up pilot programs that show really good outcomes, and then the pilot programs are stopped and the mother tongue education stops. So it's really not being supported by states at all. There are others, such as the Philippines, that have got really strong new mother tongue based multilingual education. I know that Nepal as well has been moving in this direction. Now, what actually is happening is that the introduction of the minority languages is putting pressure on the curriculum, because you have to learn your first language, you have to learn the official language, and you have to learn English. And with English being moved earlier and earlier into the primary school, that pressure is starting really early on. And I think part of the problem is really working out where a foreign language needs to be introduced into the curriculum. And that goes back to this parental pressure and all of those other things we were talking about before. There's also the perception that a number of people in minority communities seem to have that introducing the minority language puts more pressure on minority students than it does on majority language students, who only have to learn 2 languages at school, whereas we have to learn 3. I've not seen so much about that in the Asia-Pacific context, but it has come up in some of the research on Africa, that minority communities feel disadvantaged. South America has some similar sorts of themes. So there are really complex things happening around that. And I'm not really sure what the solution is. I don't think the way the world is at the moment, it's going to be possible to reduce the place of English to open space for the mother tongue. I don't think it's possible to, the way things are at the moment, to reduce the space for the official language to open space for the mother tongue. So there's some really complex stuff going on here, some really complex ideologies that are involved in this relationship. And what we actually see in a number of places is that English starts to force local languages out of the curriculum. So, for example, in Indonesia, local languages were only included as optional content subjects, local content, I think they were called in Indonesian. But when English got introduced into primary schools, it was introduced as one of these local content subjects. And so Javanese and Sumatran and things like that were discontinued in order to open up space for English. And that seems to be more the process that's going on these days than getting rid of the space of English for these minority languages. And I think minority languages really struggle to get their place in the curriculum. And I'm not really sure what we can do about it, except to advocate the learning advantages of first language acquisition and its importance for later language acquisition, that a really good basis in literacy in your first language has strong cognitive benefits for second language learning later, both for English and for the official language. And I think those sorts of things are really important. But then we have situations like Papua New Guinea, which had this really amazing vernacular literacy project that was showing these sorts of results, and they decided to spend more time on English. So even good educational data is not strong enough to overcome the ideologies. That's a very depressing answer, Brenda.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, and thank you, Spring, for asking
Thank you.
questions. Yeah.
Time.
Yeah.
So I know there were a few more online questions. Please send an email or directly to Professor Tony and Lidicott, or we can continue with the conversation. Because we don't have a long time for the classroom, we have scheduled.